She called 911 over my car, then went pale when I flashed my U.S. Marshal badge. It was a sunny Saturday morning. I parked my car outside my home, enjoying the calm neighborhood I'd lived in for years. The HOA, however, had a new hobby, micromanaging everything, especially vehicles. Karen, the self-appointed master of all keys, had recently received a set of HOA master keys, capable of unlocking community garages and, she thought, any car parked within her jurisdiction. Karen strutted up to my car, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, radiating an air of self-importance that seemed almost tangible, as if the universe had conspired to ensure she always felt in control, her perfectly coiffed hair bouncing with each step, a faint scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her, signaling that she belonged to a world of rules, regulations, and imagined authority. A woman who thrived on asserting power over anyone who dared to step outside the narrow boundaries she had constructed in her mind. And there she was, finally confronting me, the supposed violator, armed with nothing more than her clipboard, a master key, and an unshakable belief that compliance was inevitable. "This car is in violation of HOA regulations," she declared, her voice firm yet tinged with that smugness that always accompanied her pronouncements, as if every word she spoke carried the weight of law itself, though we both knew it carried nothing beyond the inflated authority of her own ego. And she held up the key, turning it between her fingers with a flourish, like a magician revealing the secret to a trick that had everyone else fooled, expecting awe, obedience, and immediate submission to her will. I calmly leaned against the hood of my car, arms crossed, eyes meeting hers with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with her theatrical display, and said softly, almost conversationally, "You won't be able to unlock it," letting the words linger in the air, heavy with an understated warning she wasn't ready to decipher, my tone measured, deliberate, and dripping with a calm that came from experience, from understanding that true power rarely needs to shout. That authority rooted in fact outweighs the authority manufactured from self-importance. Her smile faltered, that carefully constructed mask of triumph cracking ever so slightly as she inserted the key into the lock, expecting it to turn with ease, to grant her instant victory, the control she so desperately craved over everyone and everything within the confines of her carefully policed neighborhood, but it refused. She wiggled the key, pressed harder, twisted it back and forth, but the lock remained stubbornly immobile, an unyielding barrier between her and the illusion of power she had built for herself. And I could see the first flicker of panic cross her eyes, quickly suppressed, replaced with a forced grin, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that tries desperately to convince the world that nothing is wrong even as the ground shifts beneath it. Her fingers tightened around the key, knuckles whitening, as she gave one final tug, a vain attempt to assert dominance over a vehicle that, in reality, owed no allegiance to her or the HOA rules she so proudly wielded. And for a moment, I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the mental calculations racing to salvage dignity, to rewrite reality, to assert some form of authority that still somehow preserved the illusion that she was in charge, that her judgment mattered, that her rules had meaning beyond her own imagination. "See," I said, voice steady, almost conversational, letting the simplicity of the words hang in the air like a hammer striking reality against the fragile glass of her self-assurance. And I watched as her expression shifted from smug superiority to disbelief, that incredulous moment when the carefully constructed world she had relied on for so long refused to respond as expected, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and human in a way she likely hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Her carefully maintained armor of superiority now showing cracks through which frustration, embarrassment, and confusion seeped, staining the veneer of control she had wielded so effortlessly in front of neighbors, passers-by, and anyone else who might witness her daily parade of authority. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hand, the papers rattling as if protesting the futility of the situation, and she took a step back, unsure how to proceed, caught between the compulsion to act and the dawning realization that her actions were meaningless, that the key, the regulations, and the threats were powerless against what I represented in that moment. Calm certainty, controlled strength, and the quiet, unyielding knowledge that some lines, both literal and figurative, could not be crossed without consequence. Her breathing became shallow, her confidence now a fragile facade, a brittle shell ready to shatter under the weight of the truth she refused to acknowledge. And the neighbors, who had begun to gather discreetly along the sidewalks and from balconies, watched with a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and quiet satisfaction, witnessing the unraveling of the woman who always positioned herself as the arbiter of everyone else's behavior, the self-appointed enforcer of rules that didn't apply. And as Karen struggled to maintain composure, twisting the key again with a futile determination, the reality crystallized. Her power was imaginary, her authority illegitimate, and her bravado nothing more than a mask for the insecurity that propelled her relentless attempts to control those around her. "It seems the key doesn't work," I said, voice calm, almost conversational, yet carrying an undeniable edge, a quiet assertion of truth that cut through the pretense, and I could see her pupils dilate slightly, a tiny but undeniable sign of panic, that subtle human reaction betraying the confidence she so desperately tried to project, while I remained leaning against the car, unmoved, unshaken, embodying the quiet but undeniable dominance of someone who knows the boundaries, understands the rules, and carries authority that doesn't need to be displayed theatrically, a stark contrast to the frantic gestures, forced smiles, and rigid posture of the woman who had convinced herself that compliance was inevitable, control was absolute, and that this small confrontation would be another notch in her belt of neighborhood domination. Karen's lips parted, as if to speak, to fabricate an excuse, to conjure some justification for the failure of her master key. But no words came, only a desperate shuffle of papers, the soft rustle of movement betraying the storm of thoughts racing behind her eyes. And in that silence, the entire dynamic shifted, the invisible scales of authority tipping decisively, the audience of neighbors subtly acknowledging the truth. Sensing the reversal of power that had always been promised but rarely executed in such a precise, undeniable manner, and I remained calm and unwavering, a living testament to the fact that true authority doesn't need to be claimed or threatened, it simply exists, undeniable and unshakable, while Karen, the self-proclaimed ruler of HOA regulations, faced the simple, undeniable fact that she had met her match, that her key, her confidence, and her constructed aura of control meant nothing in the face of reality, leaving her exposed, flustered, and momentarily stripped of the power she so desperately tried to project. A lesson in humility and truth that would linger far longer than the moment itself, echoing silently in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. A reminder that some authority cannot be faked, some lines cannot be crossed, and some challenges cannot be overcome with mere confidence, keys, or paperwork, no matter how bold the attempt. Karen's smile vanished like mist under the harsh morning sun, leaving behind a face tight with panic and disbelief, her eyes darting nervously between the car she could not unlock and the small gathering of neighbors who had begun to watch from their windows and balconies, their curiosity barely concealed, a silent audience to the unraveling of her self-proclaimed authority, and for the first time in what must have felt like years, she realized that the control she prided herself on was slipping through her fingers like sand, impossible to grasp no matter how tightly she tried to clutch it. And in that moment, desperation took over, manifesting in the familiar ritual of modern authority. Her phone, small, sleek, and glowing with potential power, was produced from the depths of her handbag as if it were Excalibur itself, capable of restoring her dominance with a single call, a single connection to the distant agents of law and order who might, in her mind, validate her claims, enforce her imagined rules, and put an end to the embarrassing spectacle unfolding before an ever-growing audience. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911, a fine quiver betraying the frantic energy coursing through her veins, and for a split second, I could see the internal battle raging behind her eyes, the clash between the pride that had always defined her and the creeping terror of being powerless, a vulnerability she had no intention of admitting even to herself. And as the line connected, her voice rose sharply, a mixture of urgency and self-importance, projecting an authority she hoped would compel immediate action. "They're refusing HOA regulations. I need police assistance," she exclaimed, her words sharp, clipped, and laden with the indignation of someone who believed that compliance was owed to her, that the universe had somehow ordained that her declarations carried weight far beyond the reality of her position. And in that voice, trembling slightly with both fear and frustration, there was an unspoken challenge, the expectation that the officers on the other end of the line would instantly recognize the gravity of her authority and respond with unquestioned obedience. Neighbors, previously concealed behind blinds and partially open windows, began to lean forward, peering cautiously over balconies, their faces registering a mix of bemusement, curiosity, and barely suppressed amusement, sensing the growing tension, understanding intuitively that Karen's carefully constructed world of dominance and control was teetering dangerously, that the spectacle they were witnessing was not merely about a car or an HOA rule, but a rare glimpse into the unraveling of someone who had thrived on intimidation, theatrics, and the illusion of power, now confronted by forces far beyond her comprehension or control, forces that did not recognize the petty authority she wielded so aggressively. Meanwhile, I remained calm, leaning against the vehicle, arms crossed, my expression unreadable, every movement deliberate, radiating an aura of quiet certainty that contrasted starkly with Karen's frantic energy, the perfect foil to her chaos. And as she continued to speak into the phone, repeating her claims with increasing urgency, I could see the confusion beginning to register in her tone, an almost imperceptible pause when the dispatcher asked for clarification, documentation, or further details, because in her world such questions were irrelevant. The simple act of stating her rules, brandishing her clipboard and master key, should have been enough to summon immediate compliance. Yet here she was, confronted with the first real obstacle to her imagined supremacy, an obstacle she could not twist, manipulate, or demand away. The dispatcher's voice, calm, methodical, and distant, penetrated the escalating storm of Karen's anxiety, asking for specifics she had not prepared, demanding facts rather than the theatrics she had relied upon, and each question seemed to chip away at her composure, revealing the fragility beneath the layers of aggression, arrogance, and self-assuredness she habitually wore as armor, while I observed silently, letting her fumble through her excuses and stammered explanations, the very sight of her unraveling serving as a subtle but undeniable reinforcement of the truth I carried in that moment. Authority without legitimacy is fleeting, and fear or bluster cannot substitute for knowledge, experience, or real power, and the crowd of neighbors, now fully engaged, whispered softly among themselves. Their reactions varied, some shocked, some amused, some quietly satisfied at witnessing the eventual downfall of the woman who had long lorded over them with an unearned sense of superiority, the whispers forming an invisible chorus amplifying the tension. A collective awareness of the unfolding spectacle that Karen was powerless to halt. With each passing second, her urgency escalated, her voice rising in pitch and intensity, the words tumbling over one another. "They won't comply. I need the police to enforce the regulations. Please hurry." And yet, the calm, procedural response from the dispatcher refused to escalate in kind, refusing to validate her imagined power, instead adhering to protocol, asking for proof of ownership, jurisdictional authority, and documentation of the alleged violations, questions that sent her into a deeper spiral of frustration, her gestures becoming more exaggerated, the phone pressed tightly against her ear as if sheer force could compel obedience, while I remained perfectly still. A composed figure of silent authority, letting her increasingly desperate display unfold as the perfect lesson in the limitations of self-asserted control. Time seemed to stretch, the morning sun casting long shadows across the driveway, neighbors shifting behind windows and balcony railings, some holding smartphones, capturing the scene for posterity, as Karen's internal struggle became visible externally. The clash of ego, fear, and disbelief rendered her almost unrecognizable. A woman whose confidence had been her defining trait now teetering on the edge of embarrassment and panic, all while I maintained my posture, my eyes meeting hers occasionally, not with malice but with the unspoken reminder that some boundaries, like federal authority, personal rights, and undeniable truth, exist outside of her rules, beyond the petty reach of HOA declarations, and that her frantic attempt to summon reinforcement from local authorities was futile against the reality she refused to see. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dispatcher's voice returned, asking pointedly if she had verified property ownership, jurisdiction, or legal standing. And with each of these inquiries, the tight grip she held on the phone weakened, her composure faltering visibly, the veneer of mastery cracking as reality collided with her constructed world, neighbors watching intently, and I sensed the subtle shift, the moment when the energy in the air changed. Authority quietly but undeniably shifting from her frantic assertion to the calm, unmovable presence I embodied. And in that moment, Karen's phone call became less about enforcing rules and more about exposing the futility of her approach, the illusion of her control dissolving in real time, leaving only the stark, humbling truth that some challenges cannot be overcome by shouting, dialing, or posturing, that some boundaries exist that cannot be forced, that some people operate outside the scope of imagined authority, and that the consequences of misunderstanding this reality could be both immediate and unavoidable, a lesson she was about to learn in the most direct, undeniable way possible. I approached slowly, every step measured, calm and composed, exuding the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your authority is absolute and backed by law, the kind of presence that doesn't need to shout or demand compliance because it is inherently undeniable, while Karen, still clutching her phone from the futile 911 call, fumed with mounting frustration, her shoulders stiff, her face tight with disbelief, and her eyes darting between me and the small crowd of neighbors who had now fully emerged from their hiding spots, peeking over railings, leaning out of windows, whispering to one another with a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and incredulity, all of them sensing, even before she did, that the dynamic had shifted irreversibly, that the spectacle she had hoped would reinforce her imagined authority was about to collapse under the weight of reality, and I could feel her panic building. A silent storm raging just beneath the surface of her poised exterior, the sort of panic born from meeting someone whose authority doesn't bend, whose rules supersede the petty regulations she wielded like a weapon, and whose calmness radiates control in a way that is both intimidating and inescapable. Reaching into my jacket slowly, deliberately, I revealed my U.S. Marshal badge, the gold and silver emblem catching the sunlight, gleaming with undeniable legitimacy, and the effect was instantaneous. The small crowd of neighbors gasped softly, some taking a half step back, their whispers halted by the weight of what they had just seen, the symbol of real authority a stark contrast to the flimsy illusion Karen had relied on for so long, and I said evenly, without raising my voice, every word measured to maximize clarity and impact: federal jurisdiction. Your master key doesn't grant you authority over private property, and misusing emergency services can have consequences. The statement cutting through the chaos, precise, unyielding, and final, the kind of declaration that leaves no room for negotiation, no loopholes for misinterpretation, no escape from the reality of law and order. And Karen froze, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered the phone, her knuckles white against the plastic, the color draining from her face as the full magnitude of the situation hit her, her mind scrambling to reconcile the world she had always controlled with the reality she could not, the tension visible in every line of her posture, every flicker of her wide, unblinking eyes, every sharp intake of breath as she struggled to process the truth. And in that moment, the neighborhood held its collective breath, the quiet hum of anticipation replacing the murmurs of gossip. As if time itself had paused to allow Karen the realization that the universe did not bend to her rules, that the authority she had wielded so aggressively was a mere shadow of what real power looked like, and that the consequences of her actions were not theoretical but immediate and unavoidable. The 911 dispatcher's distant voice on the phone, still connected, became irrelevant, a faint echo swallowed by the presence of federal authority standing before her, the badge a tangible reminder that some lines, like federal property, jurisdiction, and law, cannot be crossed, manipulated, or ignored, and that the very act of attempting to enforce imaginary rules or to misuse emergency services carried risks she had never considered. The kind of risks that could escalate beyond a reprimand or a citation, into legal consequences that would leave her reputation, pride, and sense of control irreparably damaged. Karen's lips parted slightly, a faint tremor betraying the fear she desperately tried to mask, but no words came, only a feeble shuffle of her feet, the clipboard rattling against her chest as if it were a shield against the truth she could no longer deny. And I remained still, letting the moment stretch, the silence amplifying the lesson she was about to learn. That true authority is rooted in law, knowledge, and experience, not in posturing, intimidation, or the misuse of tools like master keys and emergency calls. That confidence without legitimacy is fleeting, and that some challenges cannot be met with ego alone, no matter how loudly one insists they should be obeyed. The crowd of neighbors, now fully engaged, murmured among themselves, some whispering quietly about the audacity of Karen's attempts, others expressing awe at the calm precision of my response. And the tension in the air thickened, the realization spreading like wildfire that the woman who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron clipboard was powerless against someone whose authority could not be questioned, whose jurisdiction was absolute, whose presence alone commanded respect and compliance without the need for threats or theatrics. And Karen, still frozen, still pale, began to sway slightly under the weight of this revelation, her mind racing to find an escape, an excuse, a way to salvage dignity, yet finding none, because in this situation dignity could not be demanded or fabricated, only surrendered gracefully or lost entirely. Her phone slipped slightly from her grip, pressing against the side of her leg, and the small clatter of it hitting the pavement seemed to punctuate the finality of the moment, a subtle but unmistakable punctuation mark in the unfolding drama. And I stepped closer, my eyes level with hers, not with anger but with the quiet insistence of someone explaining a truth that cannot be argued away, someone embodying authority in its purest, most undeniable form. The kind that leaves no room for negotiation, no possibility of misinterpretation, and no space for ego to resist. And the air itself seemed to respond, charged with tension, respect, and the humbling clarity of a lesson finally realized. That power wielded without legitimacy is a fleeting illusion, that rules cannot enforce themselves without proper authority, and that attempting to bend reality to fit one's desires against someone who operates under real law is a mistake that carries consequences far beyond embarrassment. Karen's face paled further, her breath shallow, her posture rigid, and in that instant it was clear to everyone present, the neighbors, the few passers-by, even the dispatcher still faintly on the line, that the encounter had shifted irrevocably, that the fragile construct of power she had relied upon had crumbled, and that the quiet, measured authority represented by the badge, the calm stance, and the unwavering gaze had claimed dominion over the moment, a dominion rooted not in fear, intimidation, or false rules, but in undeniable fact, law, and experience. And as Karen slowly sank back, shoulders sagging, her eyes wide with disbelief, The truth of the situation settled like a heavy weight over the scene. The master key was useless, the HOA regulations irrelevant, the 911 call futile, and the badge in my hand represented a reality she could neither challenge nor escape, leaving her exposed, humbled, and irrevocably reminded that some power is absolute, some authority unquestionable, and some lessons, once learned, cannot be unlearned, leaving a mark far deeper than embarrassment. A permanent reminder of the line she had crossed and the consequences of underestimating someone who carried true jurisdiction. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the quiet tension of the neighborhood like a harbinger of inevitability, and two uniformed officers arrived on the scene, their polished boots hitting the pavement with precision, their presence immediately commanding attention, a physical manifestation of law and order, complementing the quiet authority I already projected with the badge revealed moments ago, and Corinne's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the approaching vehicles. The sudden surge of flashing lights reflecting off her clipboard, the hood of the car, and even the nearest windows, a kaleidoscope of authority that made her earlier bravado seem almost absurd, as if someone had pulled back a curtain to reveal that the grand stage she had believed herself to control was now filled with actors who understood real power, and whose presence rendered her theatrics irrelevant. Her grip tightened instinctively on the useless master key, the key that had failed her when she needed it most, and she attempted, with a mixture of desperation and forced dignity, to explain herself, her voice rising and quivering, a combination of indignation and fear that betrayed the collapse of her internal world, and she rattled off her grievances rapidly, words tumbling over one another, a chaotic mixture of supposed regulations, imagined violations, and the insistence that she was acting in the neighborhood's best interest, as if sheer volume and confidence could somehow overwrite reality and force compliance. Yet her attempts faltered the moment the officers, professional and composed, glanced first at my badge, then at her, a silent exchange of recognition that required no words, an acknowledgement of jurisdiction that left her words hanging, hollow and impotent, suspended in the charged air like a fragile soap bubble that would burst at any touch. "Ma'am, please step back," one officer said politely, his tone calm yet firm, the voice carrying authority without aggression, and the words struck Corinne like a physical blow, reverberating through the delicate scaffolding of confidence she had built her entire identity upon. And suddenly her complaints, her accusations, her urgent 911 call, and the importance of her clipboard and master key seemed absurdly small, trivial in comparison to the reality of federal law standing resolute in the midst of her imagined battlefield, a reality she had consistently failed to acknowledge, a force that could not be intimidated, reasoned with, or ignored, and the neighborhood watched in quiet fascination, some craning over balcony railings, others peering through half-open blinds, the scene unfolding like a dramatic tableau of humiliation, authority, and the collision between ego and law. The tension so thick it could almost be felt in the sticky warmth of the midday air, as the officers moved deliberately, positioning themselves in a way that emphasized control without needing to raise their voices, a choreography of command that made Corinne's frantic gestures, flailing explanations, and trembling hands appear even more pitiful in contrast. Her face, once flushed with the pride of imagined authority, now drained of color, her lips parted in a feeble attempt to defend herself, and the colorless hue of shock and fear washed over her features as she realized the magnitude of her misjudgment, the reality that the world she had tried to dominate with rules, keys, and threats was far larger and far less pliable than she could have ever imagined. And I could see the internal gears turning in her mind, a frantic scramble to rationalize, negotiate, or somehow reclaim a fragment of dignity. Yet the calm, unyielding gaze of the officers, the presence of the badge in my hand, and the mounting crowd of silently observing neighbors left no room for escape or pretense, every calculated gesture she made only highlighting her helplessness, her vulnerability, and the stark contrast between her self-image and the undeniable truth of the moment. She muttered something incoherent about rules, regulations, and neighborhood standards, her voice weak and trembling, the words barely audible over the low hum of neighborhood whispers. The distant sirens now faded into the background as the immediate presence of authority consumed the space, rendering all her claims insignificant, and I watched as her posture shifted, shoulders sagging, head dipping slightly, the confident strut replaced with a hesitant shuffle. Each step backward punctuated by the dull thud of shoes against the pavement, a physical manifestation of the retreat her mind had already begun to undertake, the slow, reluctant surrender to reality that she could no longer challenge or control the situation. A retreat made all the more dramatic by the crowd that now quietly recorded, whispered, and exchanged glances, recognizing the spectacle of someone brought low by their own overconfidence. Someone whose belief in imagined power had collided spectacularly with the immovable wall of real authority. And in that quiet, taut moment, I could almost feel the weight of years of ego, intimidation, and self-assurance crumbling around her, the debris scattering invisibly into the neighborhood air, leaving behind only the stark realization that authority is earned, recognized, and legitimate, not declared, demanded, or imagined. Karen's steps quickened as she attempted to put distance between herself and the scene, the clipboard now dangling uselessly from one hand, the master key clutched in the other like a talisman that had lost all power, and the officers, patient and observant, allowed her retreat, a silent acknowledgement that the humiliation she was experiencing was more effective than any verbal reprimand or physical restraint could provide, and that the lesson she was learning in real time, about authority, jurisdiction, and the limits of her own power, was one that would linger far longer than any citation or warning could, etched indelibly into the memory of everyone present. The neighbors, now fully engaged, whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief at her audacity, others smirking at the poetic justice unfolding before them, and the air was thick with a combination of relief, amusement, and silent approval, a collective acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably, leaving Karen exposed, humbled, and utterly defeated, her earlier confidence nothing more than a fragile facade stripped away by the unyielding reality of federal authority. And as she finally disappeared down the street, shoulders slumped, head bowed, muttering apologies or excuses to anyone who might still be listening, the scene remained charged with the quiet aftermath of chaos, a neighborhood now acutely aware of the boundary between imagined authority and legitimate power, a lesson delivered with precision, finality, and the undeniable presence of law, experience, and calm competence. And in the lingering silence, the hum of everyday life slowly resumed. Yet the impression of the moment, the crash of ego against reality, the collapse of a self-proclaimed ruler, the quiet demonstration of true authority, remained, an indelible mark on the psyche of everyone who had witnessed it, a reminder that some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed, that some rules when misapplied carry consequences, and that confidence without legitimacy is fragile, fleeting, and ultimately powerless in the face of real law, measured authority, and unshakable calm. Leaving Karen to retreat not just from the scene, but from the illusion of control she had carried for so long, utterly defeated, silently humiliated, and forever reminded of the limits of her imagined dominion. Word spread through the HOA community like wildfire, traveling from front porch to mailbox, from balcony to backyard, carried in hushed tones, whispers, and the quiet clicks of neighbors' phones as they shared the astonishing events of the morning. And it seemed as though every resident who had ever felt the weight of Karen's self-appointed authority now had a small, secret smile of vindication, a quiet acknowledgement that the rules she had wielded so aggressively, the threats she had made, the intimidation she had projected, were nothing more than illusions shattered by a single, calm demonstration of real authority, and the gossip traveled faster than any newsletter, flyer, or official communication ever could, amplified by the magnetic intrigue of the story. A confrontation between imagined power and federal jurisdiction, between bravado and law, between a woman who believed she controlled the neighborhood and the undeniable reality that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences. Residents whispered behind closed doors at the coffee shop, and on evening walks, their voices low but sharp with a mixture of awe and relief, recounting the details of Karen's failed attempts to enforce HOA regulations, the futile 911 call, the trembling grip on her useless master key, and most importantly, the moment the U.S. Marshal badge had been revealed, a symbol that instantly shifted the balance of power, exposing the fragility of her ego, her authority, and her carefully constructed image, and each retelling emphasized not only her humiliation, but also the lesson for the community. Rules must be grounded in law, authority must be legitimate, and intimidation is meaningless without substance to back it up. Neighbors nodded knowingly to one another, sharing glances of quiet satisfaction as the story unfolded repeatedly, each telling punctuated with murmurs of disbelief that Karen, who had always projected dominance with an iron clipboard and a stern gaze, had been reduced to a pale, flustered figure, retreating from a scene she could neither control nor command. A spectacle witnessed not just by a handful of onlookers, but by an entire neighborhood now acutely aware of the limits of petty authority and the boundaries that even an overzealous enforcer cannot cross. And in the homes, yards, and common areas, the lesson took root, subtly reshaping the collective consciousness of the HOA community. Power is not declared, it is recognized. Authority is not assumed, it is granted by law. And posturing without legitimacy is a fragile, temporary illusion that inevitably collapses when tested against reality. Meanwhile, Karen's humiliation reverberated beyond whispers. Her reputation, carefully cultivated over years of self-assertion, now lay in tatters, a cautionary tale for anyone who might have once feared her stern demeanor, arbitrary rules, or abrupt threats, and the psychological shockwave she left behind rippled through every corner of the HOA, prompting discussions that ranged from polite reflection to candid critiques, as residents revisited previous encounters, reevaluated past complaints, and silently counted the countless instances where her overreach had affected daily life, realizing now, with the clarity of hindsight, that her influence was contingent, conditional, and ultimately powerless when confronted by true authority, and that the fear she had instilled was built not on substance but on bluster, ego, and the assumption that no one would challenge her or know better. The HOA board, sensing the gravity of the situation and the potential liabilities, called an emergency meeting to discuss boundaries, authority, and legal limitations, the kind of meeting that would normally be perfunctory or procedural, now charged with urgency, tension, and a very real fear of embarrassment or legal consequence, as they reviewed bylaws, regulations, and federal statutes in an attempt to clarify what members could and could not enforce, and how the board itself would ensure that no single individual could overstep their role again, the atmosphere thick with nervous energy as board members shared glances, whispered, and quietly acknowledged that Karen's overreach had exposed not only her own vulnerability, but also gaps in understanding, communication, and enforcement that could not be ignored if the HOA hoped to maintain credibility, compliance, and cohesion within the community. Outside the boardroom, residents speculated endlessly. Some praised the calm authority that had upended Karen's bluff. Others marveled at the audacity and audibility of the confrontation, and still others began quietly questioning the power dynamics in their own yards, driveways, and common spaces, realizing that control and influence are often illusions maintained through fear, assumption, or repetition rather than legitimate authority, and that the lessons learned in that brief, intense encounter had implications far beyond the morning's events, subtly reshaping relationships, interactions, and perceptions across the neighborhood. Karen herself was absent from the meeting, yet her presence was felt in the careful phrasing of rules, the cautious language of board members, and the underlying anxiety that anyone with too much self-assigned authority might be checked, corrected, or even embarrassed if they attempted to repeat her mistakes. And the whisper network of residents amplified the lesson further, sharing details of the badge reveal, the officers, polite but firm intervention, and the final retreat. Each recounting reinforcing the inevitability of legitimate authority triumphing over imagined power, until the story became almost mythic in its circulation, a parable of ego, compliance, and the invisible boundaries that govern not just property, rules, or law, but human behavior itself. A story that would be remembered, retold, and reflected upon for months to come, each repetition reinforcing the neighborhood's collective understanding of boundaries, accountability, and the distinction between perceived influence and real power. By the end of the week, Corinne's aura of dominance had dissipated entirely, replaced by a careful, tentative presence, a woman now aware that her actions carried consequences far beyond her personal ego, and that the neighborhood, once fearful, had seen the truth firsthand. Control cannot be asserted through intimidation alone. Authority must be legitimate and recognized, and even the most self-assured enforcer can be humbled when reality asserts itself decisively, with law, patience, and measured confidence, leaving the HOA community forever changed, more aware, more cautious, and more united in understanding that boundaries exist not only on paper but in principle, and that the balance of power, once misused or misunderstood, can shift in an instant, leaving a shockwave that reverberates through every porch, backyard, and common area long after the actors have left the scene. Some lessons are harsh, unyielding, and unforgettable, the kind that leave an indelible mark on both the individual who experiences them and those who witness them. And yet, these are the lessons that shape understanding, awareness, and wisdom, teaching truths that polite words, gentle guidance, or subtle hints often cannot convey. And in the aftermath of the confrontation with Corinne, the neighborhood, the residents, and even Corinne herself came to recognize the clarity of certain principles that had been obscured by ego, assumption, and overconfidence, the first of which was undeniable. Master keys, no matter how ornate, official-looking, or proudly brandished, cannot unlock federal authority, cannot bend law to personal will, and cannot confer legitimacy upon someone whose authority exists only in their own mind. A truth that became painfully, publicly, and unavoidably clear when the key failed. The lock remained unmoved, and the badge, calm and authoritative, demonstrated that the power to enforce rules is never granted by intimidation, posturing, or habit, but by legal recognition, jurisdiction, and experience, and that even the most confident self-proclaimed enforcer must reckon with the boundaries of legitimate power when confronted with someone who carries it naturally and without pretense. Misusing emergency services emerged as the second crucial lesson, one that Corinne discovered the hard way, dialing 911 in desperation, only to find that intention cannot replace authority, that panic and ego cannot compel obedience, and that attempting to bend critical systems to personal vendettas or imagined dominion carries consequences that extend far beyond embarrassment, a truth reinforced by the polite but firm intervention of the officers, whose calm presence underscored the seriousness of misuse while demonstrating the patience and professionalism that real authority entails, a lesson that rippled through the neighborhood as residents recounted the story, whispered about the failed call, and absorbed the reminder that rules and systems are designed to protect, serve, and maintain order, not to be wielded as instruments of personal power or control, and that every action, no matter how small or seemingly justified, has weight when it intersects with the law, public trust, and societal expectations. Power, the third and perhaps most profound lesson, revealed itself not in rules, regulations, or fear, but in knowledge, preparation, integrity, and the quiet confidence that comes from understanding one's own authority and limitations. The kind of power that commands respect without demanding it, that resolves conflicts without escalation, and that transforms moments of potential chaos into demonstrations of clarity, decisiveness, and control. and the entire neighborhood witnessed this principle unfold in real time, from the calm reveal of the badge to the measured interaction with Karen, the officers, understated yet firm guidance, and the slow, inevitable retreat of someone who had overestimated their influence, a lesson that extended beyond the immediate confrontation, reaching into the broader understanding of civility, boundaries, and the nature of respect, both for neighbors and for the structures that govern behavior. In the wake of these lessons, the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy. Yet it was a normalcy subtly transformed, informed now by awareness, shared stories, and the quiet knowledge that the dynamics of power, authority, and compliance are not as simple as they had once seemed. Cars were parked freely, unencumbered by arbitrary rules, and the previously rigidly enforced HOA regulations became more like suggestions than commands, a shift that reflected both a practical relaxation of control and a symbolic acknowledgement that authority without legitimacy is fleeting, easily challenged, and ultimately ineffective. And residents navigated the streets, driveways, and communal spaces with a newfound sense of autonomy, confidence, and mutual understanding. Buoyed by the collective memory of the confrontation, and the reminder that knowledge, integrity, and calm authority will always outweigh ego, bluster, and unchecked power. And Karen, the self-appointed enforcer whose confidence had been shattered publicly and irrevocably, never again attempted to touch, threaten, or interfere with my car, a symbolic and literal boundary that became emblematic of the lessons she had learned, the consequences she had endured, and the limitations of her imagined power. And while she may have continued to walk through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, muttering to herself or consulting imaginary regulations, the aura of invincibility she once projected was gone, replaced by caution, hesitation, and an unspoken recognition that the rules she had relied upon could not govern everyone, that fear could not substitute for legitimacy, and that authority must be grounded in knowledge, law, and moral clarity, not in bluster, intimidation, or assumed compliance, a reality that resonated through every conversation, porch, and driveway in the community, leaving the neighborhood subtly but permanently altered in its understanding of power, boundaries, and respect, and ensuring that the story of the failed master key, the futile 911 call, and the calm, unwavering authority of a U.S. Marshal would be recounted, remembered, and reflected upon as a defining moment, a cautionary tale, and a lesson in the enduring difference between imagined power and real, legitimate authority. Some lessons are harsh, unyielding, and unforgettable, the kind that leave an indelible mark on both the individual who experiences them and those who witness them. And yet, these are the lessons that shape understanding, awareness, and wisdom, teaching truths that polite words, gentle guidance, or subtle hints often cannot convey. And in the aftermath of the confrontation with Karen, the neighborhood, the residents, and even Karen herself came to recognize the clarity of certain principles that had been obscured by ego, assumption, and overconfidence, the first of which was undeniable. Master keys, no matter how ornate, official-looking, or proudly brandished, cannot unlock federal authority, cannot bend law to personal will, and cannot confer legitimacy upon someone whose authority exists only in their own mind, a truth that became painfully, publicly, and unavoidably clear when the key failed. The lock remained unmoved, and the badge, calm and authoritative, demonstrated that the power to enforce rules is never granted by intimidation, posturing, or habit, but by legal recognition, jurisdiction, and experience, and that even the most confident self-proclaimed enforcer must reckon with the boundaries of legitimate power when confronted with someone who carries it naturally and without pretense. Misusing emergency services emerged as the second crucial lesson, one that Karen discovered the hard way, dialing 911 in desperation, only to find that intention cannot replace authority, that panic and ego cannot compel obedience, and that attempting to bend critical systems to personal vendettas or imagined dominion carries consequences that extend far beyond embarrassment, a truth reinforced by the polite but firm intervention of the officers, whose calm presence underscored the seriousness of misuse while demonstrating the patience and professionalism that real authority entails, a lesson that rippled through the neighborhood as residents recounted the story, whispered about the failed call, and absorbed the reminder that rules and systems are designed to protect, serve, and maintain order, not to be wielded as instruments of personal power or control, and that every action, no matter how small or seemingly justified, has weight when it intersects with the law, public trust, and societal expectations. Power, the third and perhaps most profound lesson, revealed itself not in rules, regulations, or fear, but in knowledge, preparation, integrity, and the quiet confidence that comes from understanding one's own authority and limitations. The kind of power that commands respect without demanding it, that resolves conflicts without escalation, and that transforms moments of potential chaos into demonstrations of clarity, decisiveness, and control. And the entire neighborhood witnessed this principle unfold in real time, from the calm reveal of the badge to the measured interaction with Karen, the officers, understated yet firm guidance, and the slow, inevitable retreat of someone who had overestimated their influence, a lesson that extended beyond the immediate confrontation, reaching into the broader understanding of civility, boundaries, and the nature of respect, both for neighbors and for the structures that govern behavior. In the wake of these lessons, the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy. Yet it was a normalcy subtly transformed, informed now by awareness, shared stories, and the quiet knowledge that the dynamics of power, authority, and compliance are not as simple as they had once seemed. Cars were parked freely, unencumbered by arbitrary rules, and the previously rigidly enforced HOA regulations became more like suggestions than commands, a shift that reflected both a practical relaxation of control and a symbolic acknowledgement that authority without legitimacy is fleeting, easily challenged, and ultimately ineffective. And residents navigated the streets, driveways, and communal spaces with a newfound sense of autonomy, confidence, and mutual understanding. Buoyed by the collective memory of the confrontation, and the reminder that knowledge, integrity, and calm authority will always outweigh ego, bluster, and unchecked power. And Karen, the self-appointed enforcer whose confidence had been shattered publicly and irrevocably, never again attempted to touch, threaten, or interfere with my car, a symbolic and literal boundary that became emblematic of the lessons she had learned, the consequences she had endured, and the limitations of her imagined power. And while she may have continued to walk through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, muttering to herself or consulting imaginary regulations, the aura of invincibility she once projected was gone, replaced by caution, hesitation, and an unspoken recognition that the rules she had relied upon could not govern everyone, that fear could not substitute for legitimacy, and that authority must be grounded in knowledge, law, and moral clarity, not in bluster, intimidation, or assumed compliance, a reality that resonated through every conversation, porch, and driveway in the community, leaving the neighborhood subtly but permanently altered in its understanding of power, boundaries, and respect, and ensuring that the story of the failed master key, the feudal 911 call, and the calm, unwavering authority of a U.S. Marshal would be recounted, remembered, and reflected upon as a defining moment, a cautionary tale, and a lesson in the enduring difference between imagined power and real, legitimate authority.